y'all, it is Nikki. Welcome back to the channel. So before I get to the book review, I need to share with you that I finally finished one of my rough drafts this past week, which I'm so pumped about. It feels like such an accomplishment. I finished it by the end of June, and I can't remember what I said in my goals video, if I said by the end of May or by the end of June at the latest. To me, this feels like a win. I think I had it in my head that I was giving myself to the end of June. Could have done it faster, I think, if I had really stuck to my, write a chapter a day thing. But I realized partway through that, this is just self-imposed urgency. I have no reason to be moving this fast. And I'm glad that I was able to, slow it down and actually just, enjoy the process a bit more, but still finish within a reasonable time. That gives me half the summer to work on revising. So, whew, super thankful. Thank God for that. That's awesome. I think I'm going to reward myself, maybe, possibly, by buying one of the books on my rapidly growing book wish list. I haven't fully decided yet because I'm also having a bit of car trouble, so fix the car, buy books. It shouldn't surprise you that I'm genuinely undecided. But speaking of books, let's talk about Dawn of Wonder by Jonathan Renshaw real quick, because in my last video, I was only about halfway through, so my feelings on the story are much different now than what they were at that sort of halfway point where I still didn't see where the story was going. So, Dawn of Wonder by Jonathan Renshaw. I'm going to start by just making the preface that I would 100% buy this book. This is going on my wish list. This one and the sequel that has not released yet, 100% I plan to buy them. Which to me is a big deal because that is my ultimate book test. I tend not to buy books unless I have read them first, because in the past when I've tried to do that, buying books on other people's recommendations or just because they look cool, it has always been a fail. I've either just not enjoyed them that much or regretted even having them on my shelf. So when I read a book and it has my stamp of shelf approval, I would spend money on this and put it on my shelf, that is a big deal. So I want to start with that. There were so many things about this book that I appreciated and appreciate more now at the end than I did at the halfway mark. I understand now what people meant when they recommended it to me for its uplifting quality, because it was just so meaningful and packed such an emotional punch. It's very much a coming of age story. We have a young protagonist who has some awful things happen to him in his childhood that sets him on a trajectory toward kind of vengeance for that awful thing. Ends up in a sort of military academy where he learns all the skills he will need to one day right that wrong. In the process, he actually meets a lot of really great people and starts to develop into this really strong, really intriguing young character. So it's a little bit like Harry Potter-ish in that you're in this academy setting, you have a young character with kind of a lot to prove, a lot to make up for, growing, and you're going to all the classes with them and learning all the things with them. So that's a little bit Harry Potter-ish. It's also a little bit Kingdom series-ish, but it has the writing style, the flavor of the more classic fantasies like your Lord of the Rings or your Hobbit. It's not deep POV, it's more omniscient narrator walking you alongside these characters through the adventure. Very much that classic fantasy feel. Young protagonist doesn't always work for me. I don't always love reading about kids, but this one, right from the beginning, immediately, I was tapped into this kid character. I liked him, I respected him, I was intrigued by him right away. Very well researched, very well. I'm assuming all the information in this book is accurate, and there's a wild amount of information. When they're going to class, they are teaching all the things and we are learning all the things, which admittedly is not for everyone. Maybe you're kind of like me and sometimes it's okay, let's just get to the plot. But as just a resource for writing fantasy and for medieval stuff in general, that alone would be a reason for me to buy it, just so I have access to that, oh man, what's that part where they were making swords, or what's that part where they're learning this fighting technique or whatever. So useful. I aspire to that level of research. The camaraderie of the group that forms around the main character while he's in the academy is just fabulous. I love that. I'm realizing more and more how much I love that kind of group gathered around a strong moral leader thing. It's just one of my favorite tropes. The characters really do shine. You really kind of fall in love with this group of young people, and so I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes and how they all grow in the next book, which brings me to my last point. Things to know before you read it so that you don't give up. I had a few misconceptions going into the book, which I think affected my reading experience. So for one thing, the pacing was something that kind of took me by surprise and slowed me down a little bit, both literally and just like mentally and motivationally. It is a slower pace. The beginning is fairly quick, and then it really slows down in the academy sequence especially. And I was starting to wonder as I was in there, like, where are we going with this? This feels like a lot of learning happening and not a lot of action. Because of the nature of that structure, we're living years of training with our character, but you can't show entire years of training. There was a fair amount of time jumping that needed to happen in order to get us where we needed to go. When you're doing time jumping, it's often necessary to do a little bit of like info dumping just to fill the reader in, like the next 6 months looked like this, here's what everyone was up to. That's just like necessary, but I do admit to doing a little bit of skimming in those parts just because I wanted to see where it was all leading. But that's the thing, where it was all leading was just so worthwhile. I was so pleasantly surprised by the character's epiphany moment that was like, oh, I did not see this coming, and now I'm just really happy and want to buy this book. Not to mention the ending, which was like, yes, he set it up for a really great sequel, but that brings me to my point. I didn't realize that this was going to be part of a series. I was under the mistaken impression that it was a standalone book. So that was part of the reason why the pacing was really confusing to me, because I thought that we only had one book to accomplish all the things that had been sort of promised, and it was like, how on earth are we going to get there and do that if we have this much like training in this earlier phase of the story? But now that I understand that it is not in fact a standalone and the sequel just hasn't come out yet, it makes so much more sense, because I realized that what I thought the story was heading towards was actually a very distant promise, and that the more immediate promise was something that actually was resolved within all the pacing and structure of this first book. Now I see why all that training and all that setup was necessary character building for how the story had to end to prepare this character for what's coming next. But if that's something that's maybe bogging you down when you try to read it, I would just encourage you, like, do not give up. It is worth getting to the end. It's a really beautiful story, meaningful in that best way that I think all stories should be. We need more books like this, so I'm pumped for Jonathan Renshaw to put out the sequel whenever that happens so I can add both of them to my shelf. Those are my thoughts on Dawn of Wonder by Jonathan Renshaw. I really am happy that books like this exist, and Lord willing, future years will only see more of them being written and put out into the world. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Comment below with the last book you read that you said, I'm going to buy this and put it on my shelf. And as always, do not forget to spend some time in the clouds today.